Hey there, welcome to our live stream today. We're going to be talking with Josh Krakauer. He's the CEO of a social media B2B marketing company called Sculpt. Super excited to chat with him. We're going to be talking specifically about B2B social media. We're going to be really digging into kind of what makes B2B social work, best practices, optimization, all kinds of really great stuff. So I'm super excited to bring him on. Before we get into the questions and introduce Josh, I just want to do a couple quick plugs. Of course, first of all, if you have not already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel here and be sure to catch our future live streams. We've got a bunch of sessions coming up through the end of the year, and would love to have you join us. And then secondly, if you are not already a member, check out our content marketing community. It's a free Slack group. It's called Top of the Funnel. And we do all kinds of Slack AMAs and share content and teardowns and job opportunities and all kinds of great stuff in there. All focused on content marketing, SEO, and kind of broader marketing strategy, including social media and some other topics. So if you're in marketing, whether you're in-house, freelance, agency, what have you, definitely join our group, Top of the Funnel. You can find it at the website yesoptimist.com/tofu, TOFU, and it's a free group. So we'd love to have you join us there. Great. Well, with all that said and all the announcements out of the way, I'm going to introduce our guest today. Josh, again, is a social media strategist, CEO of Sculpt, a B2B marketing and social media agency. Super excited to have him on today. Hey, Josh, how are you?
What's up, Tyler?
Oh, just hanging in there. Yeah, man, we've obviously known each other for several years, but I'm super excited to have you on today. I know we have been kind of talking offline a lot about some of the stuff we're going to cover today around social media and some of the kind of internal pieces of it, as well as some of the actual execution of social media marketing. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to dig in. For everyone joining the stream here, do you want to just start with kind of a quick background on yourself and I guess how you really got into the B2B marketing and maybe social media space and started Sculpt and your whole story?
Yeah, how long you got? No, I'm kidding. It's not that long of a journey, to be honest, because social media hasn't necessarily been the sort of channel it is today for since we started. Basically, the short story is, Sculpt today is a B2B focused social media agency. So we're helping companies reach their customers, build community, and mostly drive leads and close deals with paid and organic social. But the early days in my career, before it was a career, was putting up YouTube videos about, drag racing cars in 2006 and, figuring out early social media, which were community forums and message boards, which, hopefully are like buried deep in Google search results today. But, that sort of led to our early hypothesis, so to speak, coming out of college, which was early social media marketing days where the platforms like Facebook were maturing. And around 2011, beginning of 2012, started Sculpt to help local businesses be better at communicating with customers and actually leveraging these type of platforms. I mean, at that time, social was so different. There were basically two primary channels. The biggest companies in the world were the companies that you followed on social media. Everyone talked about what Coca-Cola was doing on social. When was the last time you heard about Coca-Cola on Twitter? And you don't. But at the time, the biggest brands had the biggest presence and footprint, and all the small people really didn't know what to do. So you either hired an intern or you outsourced it to like a traditional media company that kind of was ghostwriting tweets, and then that was about it. So we really wanted to come in and say, we'll provide a very personalized social media management service back when organic reach was kind of the play.
Yeah, I was gonna say I remember meeting you and kind of being aware of what you guys were doing with Sculpt back. As you said, I think it was 2008, somewhere in that range where you guys were just kind of like getting started. And I remember I was like, I was so envious of what you guys were doing because social media was like so foreign to me, and it was still such a like a wild west world of like marketing. You know, like nobody really knew what the hell they were doing on social media at that time. And I remember you guys were coming in and like just adding like a level of sophistication that I think nobody was really doing then.
Well, and for context, we started at a local level. I mean, in the agency world, you always want to have kind of a niche to sort of build your reputation on. And I hadn't even worked at an agency before starting Sculpt. I won't pretend like I'm some industry veteran that then spun off their own agency. You know, we started from the ground level, and so it just happened to be that, helping regional companies in where we went to college in Iowa City was was sort of a big competitive advantage we had, and was something that we saw a huge, clear need for, helping companies figure this stuff out. And I mean, frankly, we're still helping companies figure this stuff out. It's just that everything has matured in that time and become more sophisticated.
Yeah, for sure. And actually that's a great introduction to the next topic that I want to talk about, which is I think as social media has matured, it's become more of like an integrated part of the rest of the marketing strategy, really. And I think you guys have also kind of evolved some of the work that you're doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of how you see social kind of fitting into the overall picture, and also maybe some of the extended work that you guys are doing to help bring all that stuff together?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's amazing what a difference 10 years makes. In the beginning, we were trying to convince companies that like their profiles should be pages, as an example. And today, it feels like we're trying to convince companies that their pages should be more like profiles, and that they should be more, they should actually tap their people to be their brand on social. So it's just a completely different world. And the role of social is probably the exact same. I mean, I don't think we're reinventing anything here, but it's the fastest way to get a response from your market. It's an extremely flexible platform in terms of where it could sit in an organization, in an enterprise. It does a lot of hard work. It does a lot of heavy lifting for many different things. It's not typically just one thing. It's really revenue, reputation, relationships. I'd say that's social media. So anything that builds off of that is important. At the sort of earliest stage in your company, it's one of your revenue and relationship channels, right? It's one of the first place people can sort of learn who you are. It's marketing sales, basically. But as you grow and mature and you see larger organizations, I'm sure a lot of people that are paying attention today, they work at organizations that are more complex. You have hundreds or thousands of employees, or will get there eventually. You have thousands, tens, or hundreds of thousands of customers eventually. Now all of a sudden it becomes, if you think about the role of revenue, now it's about customer success too. It's about talent attraction and bringing new people on your team, engaging employees and having them participate in building the brand. So it's still a brand platform, but it could mean different things depending on how you're using it that day.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah. So that actually brings up an interesting point, which I think is maybe something that a lot of people struggle with, even if they don't recognize, is that social can kind of span a spectrum, right? It can be like a very one-to-one, like personal channel where you can be like engaging one person and like talking to them about their problem or helping them, solve an issue or whatever it is, or it can be like kind of a broadcast channel where you're just like putting things out into the world and like hoping that they get traction or whatever. So how do you think about that? I mean, like, is it everything to every company, or is it, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, it is both, but you might value those two things differently. And I think in the beginning, it's just really not that efficient to go one to one to one to everyone.
Right.
But when you're at the stage where handling customer interactions is something that's really important, I would just look at it as a team, but separate roles on that team. So in the beginning, you might have one person that's sort of handling both sides of that, shaping the external message, working with sales and product to make sure that we're the kind of content we're putting out there is moving people through our funnel. But at the same time, building and strengthening relationships with individuals. That's important, but probably not as important in the beginning as maybe people like to think it is. Like, you can waste a lot of time on community management, but if you don't have that many customers talking about you, you're really trying really hard to get people to talk about you. I think it's a little misleading because we look at a lot of big companies that do that stuff at scale, and it's just not necessarily the way that everyone should sort of model their own team. But at the very least, thinking of them as two very separate activities, where in the beginning you might weight more things towards the broadcast and targeted messaging side, where you're externally messaging and paying attention to what other people are saying, and like doing a little bit of the responses and one-to-one stuff, but that might grow as you grow your organization.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think like just to get to kind of the heart of that, it's very similar to like what we talk about with content marketing, right? Which is like content is not a monolith. Like there's not just like one type of content that does everything or can do anything. Like it's really about what are your specific goals, and then creating content or pursuing a strategy that is going to achieve that specific goal. And you might have multiple goals, and you might be doing multiple types of activities. And I think it's probably the same thing in social, right? Like there's certain types of activities that are going to help you grow your audience if it's at zero, and there's certain types that are going to help you engage your existing audience or manage your existing community or build, strengthen those relationships or whatever it is. So it's really about going beyond just thinking about like social media marketing as a thing and really dividing it into specific goals and strategies.
Yeah. And if you have, you have to expand your resources to do everything. And I think companies that try to do everything too quickly will end up in a place where you don't do anything very well. So I only bring that up just because, in the beginning, I think nailing your sort of external message, getting it to perform well as a channel, as a traffic generation channel, an acquisition channel, or, as a relationship building channel, whatever you decide it is in the beginning, it is important. And then as you get more resources, you can start to do, scale up back and forth interactions with people on Twitter and all these other community channels.
Right. Yeah. I mean, really, that's I feel like that's most of marketing at some extent, right? Is that like as you become more successful at a certain thing, like you need more people involved, like there's more complexity. You lean into it, and so that's obviously why you hire more people to your marketing team, or you expand what you're doing, and you need more help.
Yeah. Exactly.
Cool. So I want to take that concept to kind of the next level, which is this thing you and I have been discussing, which is this idea of the social media maturity model. And I know this is like a framework that you guys use to kind of assess and understand how companies are doing social like at the moment. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what the factors are that go into that maturity model?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this topic as optimizing B2B social, and why it's optimization, which everyone loves to talk about, is because that's all about improvement towards a specific goal. And what you generally see is at every organization stage, from early stage, getting off the ground to a large enterprise level, you're always trying to level up your team's ability, your team's capacity, the impact you're making from all of these programs. And we wanted a way to measure where a company was at currently and have that be sort of this open source idea where anyone could use the same framing to basically describe, this is where our organization is as a social media team. Social media team is even like a triggering word for some people because they have, a marketing person whose part-time role in the beginning is social media. So like they don't consider themselves to be on a team. But if you look at it as, well, every organization has to, no one can just skip these steps. Everyone starts with, someone part-time owns social. Then they eventually give more resources to it. Then eventually someone's full-time job is social media management and the strategy around it. Then eventually it becomes, those functional areas of social become individual contributors. And then eventually you start to be more complex and you speak to different people in different regions in different ways, or for different areas of your product. or different departments have their own social media. Those are very different versions of a organization, and it's important just to look at what we describe the factors break down into the people side and the execution side. And so a lot of times people focus a lot on the execution side. How do we increase the content production that we're doing, both in quality and in volume? How do we scale up our paid ads program? How do we get more sophisticated with our reporting and analytics so we can learn things? But then they don't scale up the team and the people part. And some of the team and people part that we look at are things like, of course, who owns social, how many people are involved functionally in that role, but also what are your team's beliefs around social? Does executive buy into it? Do executives support it, or are executives leading it even? Are they active on social themselves and pressuring the company to be more present? How you value those different things are really important. And so we do look at those two things as the main factors things break down into, and look at it on a spectrum of level 0, where you've sort of claimed your profiles and you're sort of waiting to be active in the world, which is, we have names for all of these if you're imagining it like a theatrical production, and that's kind of the understudy role. They're kind of just waiting in the wings, all the way to a level 5 organization, where if you were to point out almost any enterprise level tech company that's been around and been through all the levels of social media evolutions that have happened, an IBM, Adobe, those type of companies have a very sophisticated program with dedicated owners, both at the channel level and the geographic level and at the department, product level.
Right.
So they're clearly someone you could learn from, but not someone you can't go from that to that,
Uh-huh. So I have a very basic question, which is like, first of all, do you think of the maturity model as like higher is always better? Because one thing that I hear there is like, if I'm someone who works at Adobe in the social team, and there's 50 people that I have to work alongside, to some degree that can make things more challenging. So is it that like the kind of the more mature the better generally you see the program, or is there like what's the nuance there? How do you use that as a measurement tool?
I mean, the more mature your social media organization is, I'd say the bigger the impact you can likely make overall. But no, I don't think I don't think most organizations get to that stage, because your company on its own is not that complex. It sort of does go along with the stage of maturity of the rest of your organization. It follows your marketing maturity as well. And it's just important to look at it in an isolated way. I mean, we didn't invent a maturity model. I think Gartner uses that to consult with clients and conduct research and say, here's where you're at on a scale. We just have our own version of it that that helps companies determine, and that we basically practice and teach people to say, is your social media organization at least in line with where your enterprise is, where your organization is? So if you're a quick moving, rapid growth technology company, but your social media organization, or like the resources you're putting into it, aren't keeping up, then you can't have expectations of the impact it's going to make to be wildly outside of that. So it just sort of right sizes what you should be doing versus the impact you want to be having at your scale.
Right. So it's really so if I'm say I'm going through this process and I'm a 2 or whatever, then really if that's good or bad is a function of what my expectations are or what my goals are.
I think it is important that every company, whether when you're trying to decide how do we level up as an organization, how do we make a bigger impact with social, are we behind where we should be or ahead? First you sort of make that assessment of your people and execution on these dimensions, and you then you need a vision or a goal to get to the next step. And this just puts it into perspective of saying, it's totally okay to be at a current level and be rocking it. So I would consider an organization at the level 2 level, so if you think of like that right in the middle of the social media maturity model, just think of yourself as someone who's maintaining social media really well, who's really measured, who's testing some things, but like mostly has a very consistent presence. It's good to get to consistent. You have to get to consistent before you get to, you know, high growth and experimental and accelerating. But like that would be a good goal to get to if at the moment you're kind of just doing random acts of marketing and posting, you know, without really a lot of direction. The first step is to really have a strategy and be consistently executing it to see an impact. And I think that's perfectly fine.
Right. So as an organization, using the maturity model to kind of measure my own thing, like what I'm thinking here is like the key insight that I'm going to get is basically like based on our goal, whatever our goal is, whether it's to, you know, increase our presence or drive more leads or drive more traffic or whatever it is, do we have kind of the right resources to achieve that goal, or are we going to have to like level up to make that a possibility?
100%. And where are we versus competitors? I bring this up in this specific framework so much because I think when talking about optimization, you can't do it in isolation. You can't just say more content publishing frequency is better, or, you know, more paid advertising is better just in isolation. It needs to be against what? And I think a lot of companies, when deciding to invest in their social media program, you need a trigger. Sometimes that trigger is seeing a competitor far exceed your pace of growth, or, you know, at least certainly at the executive level, what we typically hear from clients is, you know, our CEO saw XYZ sort of a competitor has this many followers, or their ads came across our feed, or their social media program looks better than us, a more qualitative assessment. But by being able to frame it against something like this is where we are versus where we should be, and doing your own landscape analysis, this isn't really like a pitch towards our sort of process. I think anyone should do this in their own organization if they want to put more resources into it. Show where you live next to other organizations, but not just on a spectrum of how many followers do you have, how many posts do you publish, like the activity metrics. Also make sure you go to LinkedIn and say how many people do they have dedicated to content or social roles at their team. How many people are dedicated to video production in their company? Well, if they have 3 video producers and we're trying to, you know, make our content better and we don't have any, like, you can't, maybe they're 2 levels ahead of you. And so we need to figure out, that's your pitch for moving more in that direction.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's such a valuable tool. I imagine for internal teams or people who are, you know, having a conversation with a stakeholder. And like you said, I have to imagine that's a very common thing where, you know, my boss came in and said, you know, our competitor's killing us at Twitter. Like, how do we get better or whatever? And you have to have some kind of like objective frame of reference to say, well, yeah, we could achieve that too, but look at how much more sophisticated their stuff is. Like, we need more budget, or we need more team members, or, you know, we need a more buy-in from the executive leadership team, or whatever the sort of apples to apples comparison turns out to be. Just having that frame of reference, I imagine, is just like super, super helpful. I'm curious, and not to put you on the spot, but do you have, I don't know, internally or whatever, like specific companies in mind that you guys think of at like each level of the maturity model?
I feel I can do this without much of a. It doesn't take me long to look at a company, and, you know, in a few minutes, or, you know, in a few seconds or a minute, I could probably tell you where they're at. But I don't necessarily have. We've been deciding how much we want to do that. I've asked some companies that have taken our assessment before if they're willing to, you know, publicly like agree that they are at this level. But no, I don't typically do that. What we just put out there is, you know, again, I think the Adobe type example is a good example of look at that as someone who I wouldn't try to benchmark against if you're just getting started in any way, because they're at, you know, just look at the level of execution they do to understand, you know, that they're at the sort of farthest level. And then, you know, most people are somewhere in the middle. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to put someone on the spot. which is kind of boring, but
fair enough. No, I understand. Yeah, I mean that's a that's a whole thing. So I'm curious, as you're talking to various companies about this model and kind of assessing where they are versus like their goals, are there sort of common threads there? Are there areas where most companies are sort of need to level up specifically to achieve their goals, or anything like that?
yes, I'd say the one of those things just comes down to paid media, how they're spending. I see a lot of companies. This is part of what I like to talk about in B2B social too. I mean, maybe people that are watching this are like way ahead of the game, and they have, you know, dedicated demand gen teams, right? And so like they obviously invest heavily in paid acquisition or paid social as a channel. But maybe if you then talk to their social media manager or social media managers, they would say that they don't have any sort of paid budget allocation to be able to amplify their work. And what I generally see is this is the problem, is that we put too much weight in 2020, 2021 into organic social's impact it should be having from the corporate channel account level, like from the main logo account. And the truth is like that's a problem, because when you look at the organizations that perform the highest at each of those levels and up, I mean, they are spending significantly and probably interact with potential customers far more, put way more weight on the paid advertising side to amplify every piece of content. So as an example, posting less and promoting more. I sound like a salesman for like Facebook or LinkedIn, but or Microsoft, but the truth is that's just how you can see better impact right away. And where companies tend to fall short is like they'll have what seems on the surface like, wow, their content looks really beautiful, so to speak, like it's polished. A designer obviously made the template for it, or they're producing a really good show, they're going live like this, but they're not putting any amplification behind it to make sure it actually gets to people and distributes, and they're relying solely on an individual to somehow magically make that appear to the right people instead of to the same 1% of the audience that follows them, which is more like a nurturing drip, or it's mostly like talking to your employees because that's who mostly follows you. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues I see beyond dedicated resources for social and investing the right amount of people is under investing in paid and offsetting that with just frequency, just trying to make more stuff.
Yeah. Oh man, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we see the same thing in content marketing land, right? Which is that people want to publish more and use that as kind of a lever to try to drive more results without thinking about the promotion or the links or any of the other stuff that really goes into making a difference there. And I think like the prevailing misconception is that your success in terms of like driving traffic or social media or whatever like the metric is just purely a function of like the effort and the quality of the content, and that like if we just make more better content, it will magically unlock these doors and we'll see tons of growth and all this stuff. And I think like what people don't understand or maybe misunderstand is that the way most channels are set up, it's not like a meritocracy. Like it's not just like if I send out the best tweet today, like I'm going to win Twitter. Like that doesn't work because I only have 100 followers. It's not going to be seen by enough people to get the level of amplification. Whereas, yeah, if you are, Adobe and you have millions of followers and you put out great content, you're going to have an organic reach engine. But if you're starting somewhere on the lower or middle end of that spectrum, that's not going to happen magically. Like you have to build that audience first before you can expect it to kind of amplify on its own.
Yeah. It's an and, not an or. It's not and, or make our content more interesting, more relevant. Right. I just think that I
should clarify that.
Yeah, no, it's just that's the issue is empathizing with the in-house marketers though. When you have this, like I know a lot of people get maybe sometimes roll their eyes when it comes to like asking for more budget for paid advertising because it's like that's out of my control, or that's not been decided by me, or that belongs to a different team like demand generation versus the brand or communication folks that are running social. And there's no way around the fact that, I mean, there are ways of first, going back to that maturity model and saying, like, look, people that are a step above us are spending considerably more, which you can just see through, the number of ads that they're running on ad libraries. Like, since all of people's paid social ads are now very transparent, you could see what competitors or peers are doing in terms of spending. Running a little informal survey to ask other people in your network, like, what are you spending on paid amplification? Like, that kind of stuff can help. But just making a pitch, to do this incrementally, like, can we spend a little bit extra? The way that we look at it is, if you were to, LinkedIn has done some really great research as an example on, well, it actually doesn't come from LinkedIn, but they have a think tank, the B2B Institute, that I highly recommend people read about and read some of the research from, which pulls from some existing research around how brands are built and applies it to the B2B context. And one of the things that they talk about is how to balance brand and performance. And I think in the B2B world, we bias towards performance, of course, and so our advertising spend is, maybe you'd imagine it to be 80% driving a direct response of some kind, and then 20% everything else. And generally that breakdown in like the consumer world, the average should be 60% brand, 40% performance to get the biggest long-term lift.
Right.
That's some of what they have sort of come to learn. In the B2B world, it maybe is closer to 50-50, and in certain contexts you can still, spend, especially in an early stage, you probably still want to spend more on driving performance with that budget. But either way, it's spending significantly more on building familiarity and recall with your brand is underrated. And it's something that I think you can use, that research you can use to sort of make the case that we need to be spending more on direct response oriented advertising.
Yeah, that's a super interesting insight. So I think that's a good step towards the conversation around like optimization. And I think when we think about optimization broadly, I think the question that a lot of people miss is like, what are we truly optimizing for, right? And so it's easy, or maybe easier, to optimize for sort of short-term things that we can measure right now, which I think is what you're saying, right? Is that like people over-index on performance campaigns because I can see right now that if I put in $1 into a performance campaign, I'm going to generate $1.50 in revenue. And so like, obviously I would focus my effort on that. But the flip side of that is what's going to be the case a year from now. And if I invest in my brand, if I pivot 50% of that spend to my brand and start building an organic audience, is that now going to decrease my cost of acquisition by 50% in the next 12 months, right? And it's a lot harder because you can't know that until you spend the money, right? Like how, or maybe you have another thought about that. Like how do you know that before you spend the money?
Well, you can rely a little bit on past research, I think, to help make the case a little bit. But yeah, you don't necessarily know outside of that, trusting the process, I guess you would say. I think generally, if you're in growth mode at the very early stage, like, you need to get customers to be able to sort of make the case for the next, the first real Series A or something, or for the ability to sort of scale up to the next level and put more resources behind it. Then I do think mastering direct response, mastering getting customers through social is really super important. But there are ways of measuring brand outside of that. You can't. Basically, it is proven that your conversion rates will go up, obviously, if people know your brand. We all know that social media, all marketing is easier for a brand that you know already, because you already have passed that awareness point of people knowing who you are, trusting what you do.
That's such a great insight. Sorry to interrupt you, but I don't want to lose this thought, which is that, if your boss is coming to you and saying like, hey, why don't we, why isn't our social media presence like, Geico or Burger King or whatever, whatever big brand that they're looking at and thinking about, it's helpful to maybe remind them or remind yourself, like, yeah, they've spent years investing in brand advertising specifically to make it look this easy now. Like, it didn't just happen.
Yeah, and people have asked questions like, how do you figure out what that right budget is, or what are, the different ways of thinking about it? I think at the earliest levels of maturity, I would put as much into making paid social work economically for your business as possible. So that number is going to be different for different businesses, but use that as a factor of, the sales, the typical sort of equation as you'd expect of, so social is going to be really good for driving top of the funnel. So how much can we spend to acquire a lead, knowing that they will convert into a customer and still be profitable based on their estimated lifetime value? That's how you come up with that initial paid ads budget. And then your number that you're testing is very much based on, ideally spending enough per day that you could hypothetically get at least one customer, or if you're just starting, maybe one lead per day at a minimum. But if you can spend up to $100 per lead, you shouldn't spend less than that per day, let's say. That's just like a very simple way to look at it. But moving towards the place where you kind of have big customers and some traction, I think you can think of it more as expanding that brand advertising percentage from maybe it was 0 or 10 to 20 to 30 to 50, and for the purpose of thinking long term, as you talk about it, of building familiarity with everyone, not just like these very targeted segments. Your early advertising should probably be very, very targeted based on these are the buyer profiles, the customer profile that's most likely to convert. But after a while, to actually build brand familiarity, you have to reach all your category buyers, like anyone that could be a potential customer to some extent. And ideally you're reaching them, on a weekly basis, so the only way to do that, which is really hard to do, obviously. And I actually heard a really good podcast on this. I'm not even going to take credit for this idea. I liked the way that Slack's former CMO talked about this on the B2B marketing podcast. I think that's what it's called. And it was a recent episode, and he was basically describing how what Slack did around brand advertising is that they would run these brand campaigns in very specific geos, so very specific geographic markets, and then run there's surveying tools you can use. There's platforms like Attest. There's platforms like SurveyMonkey that let you run, consumer panels of people in a region, tech workers in San Francisco, and you can then poll them before and after to see, if they recall your brand after your campaign. So you run sort of smaller campaign tests, and you should put budget into running small market tests to a broader audience to see how it works.
Yeah.
That's how you do it. It is still experimental, but you work your way up to proving the use case.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So just to take one step back on the kind of the specific number that you put out there, which is basically, so the question that we got here was, what's sort of a good place to start with your budget? How much should you spend, or what's like a meaningful number? And I think what your answer was is that whatever sort of your max cost per acquisition for a customer or cost to acquire a customer is, that should be like your daily budget. So if you can spend $100 to acquire a new customer, then you should spend $100 a day on ads to kind of get a sense of if it's going to work. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know generalities can be pretty dangerous, so I'm hesitant to sort of speak
Sure,
on behalf of the paid media world, breaking me down. But I do think that that's at least more in line than what people typically do.
Sure.
I'll say that not everyone can work their way up. Not everyone is at that point yet. That would, if you have spent $0 and now all of a sudden we're asking you to spend, $500 cost per acquisition times 30 days, you're not obviously going to easily spend $15,000 or $1,500, any of that, coming from 0. But you should look at that as a better, more realistic way to start to see the results you actually need, and spending significantly less than what it would cost to get a lead per day, for instance, is going to take a very long time for these paid ad platforms to optimize on their own towards finding the right customers, because they're fed by the data you give it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's a good point. Is even if you can't reach that level, like right out of the gate, you can at least know that, like, okay, the benchmark is 100 and I'm only spending 20. So like maybe my data is not as reliable, or maybe I shouldn't like assume that it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Right
Or do
away.
it for, I'd rather people spend a little bit up front, let's say, to sort of make sure that your creative is the biggest variable in success, truthfully. I mean, obviously you need to be targeting the right people. Obviously you need to, not be like, wildly off in that level of precision, but your creative is like 40% of the variable of success. So like you kind of want to nail the message first. So like try not to test too many things at once, get the message right, the offer right, like what is something compelling. But then, I would rather have people spend more per day, like a realistic amount per day, but turn it off after 2 weeks than for people to, spend a tiny amount per day for a month and a half just because they were trying to roll out their budget.
Sure, yeah. Well, and that's a good point. So I guess the other component there of, let's say we're starting from scratch, we're running an experiment, and we've identified, hey, it's $100 is what we're going to be able to spend per day, and say that matches our cost per acquisition target. How long should I let that run, or how long until I sort of have meaningful data in general? Do you think?
As long as you can, but I mean, I think at the beginning. This is really, ideally something that you have. You're not taking all your advice right now from me on how to set this budget, but this guidance, at least, is what we look at. Is you're really looking at the micro things on the first 3 to 5 days. Let's say you really want to be looking at. When people always say like it needs a week or 2 weeks or a month to see if it's working, I mean that could be true generally to see if economically like this channel works.
Right.
I think you can you need a longer time frame to do that. We like to do tests in terms of 30, 60, 90 days, let's say. But you should know within 3 days, typically, if you're spending enough, if it's even going to be somewhat feasible, to some extent, or if something is wildly off. It's hard to give complete generalities because everyone has kind of their own secret sauce, it seems like, or different platforms vary by platform. Like Facebook, they say that you exit sort of the learning phase at a different point. They point to like 1,500 or 2,000 impressions, I believe, on your ad, where it starts to really get a feel for the how that creative is going to perform versus LinkedIn. I don't know if there's that same number applies, but we use a similar a similar philosophy. Once you're at a couple thousand impressions, like it would be rare. I mean, there's a lot of headwinds in the world, but like it'd be rare that something would all of a sudden completely tank the next day.
Right.
It can.
You have a sense for kind of the general trend, right? Like
is
this A, like generating some results, and B, are the economics or the unit economics like sort of improving over time?
Yeah, I would still just tell people generally a week. Let's say a week, that people like answers.
A week is a good benchmark.
Give it a week.
Yeah, I mean
give it a week.
That's helpful. Yeah. Give it a week, and then again, I would say from what you're describing, it sounds like look at the trend. Also, don't just look at where are we at right now and is that going to work, but has it decreased 50% over that week? Has our cost per acquisition or whatever the metric is that matters to you, and then you can use that to kind of say, okay, if it decreases another 50% next week, then maybe it works. So maybe it's worth continuing.
Yeah, I think it's overall important that you, more than anything, I think in the beginning, when it comes to like maturing your paid social program, in the beginning you kind of want to just start by trying to dial in the offer more than anything. Like if it's a content offer, like you should be able to determine pretty quickly, is what we're offering people compelling or not? Are we getting 20% of the people that click this to download a guide? Well, it's directionally, we know it's going to be on track. We just might need to dial in some other things now. So try to like get the offer right first, and know that the more friction you have, the bigger the ask you have for an offer, and the harder to reach your audience, the probably more you're going to have to spend comparatively to sort of dial that in. So it's going to be harder to dial in a demo, direct to demo, or more expensive to do that for a demo than for a content offer. And I think that's the other part, that there's these variables that I don't want to generalize completely, but that I think people need to think of it in that way.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, it's always the challenge there is like, giving people like some kind of a benchmark, but obviously, there's no right answer without knowing the details of the specific thing that you're trying to do, and who you're trying to reach, and all the variables that go into it. But I did want to just circle back really quick on one thing that you mentioned. So, as we think about, first of all, I think what you're describing is, first of all, phase one is always like, get the most basic version of this like up and working. And then phase two is like thinking about optimization, or like, how do we improve or mature, whatever your terminology is there. And one of the interesting things there that we talked about, we were specifically talking about the idea of like brand versus performance, and how part of your optimization strategy actually might be shifting, away from short-term, what feels like short-term optimization, by focusing on performance and investing more in brand. And you mentioned, just kind of easing into that and using that as sort of a test. And I really like that approach. So, say, if I'm starting from scratch right now and I am spending 100% of my budget on performance, maybe step one is take 10% of that and put it in brand. And then you also mentioned using it as like a very controlled experiment. So maybe I'm targeting that brand spend to a specific city or a specific state or a specific segment of my audience, and then layering on some kind of a performance campaign to see if that has like a meaningful impact on my, again, my CAC, or whatever my metric is that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think overall the idea is just being intentional about brand building. The problem that people face with social, in not just B2B context, but especially in B2B, is that organic social media is typically the brand is owned by brand, is like our brand reputation, is our brand channel, but then paid is a lot of other things, and not usually brand. It's usually driving a result. And so I think people do that mostly because if they feel like if it's owned by a brand, then it can be more intangible, it can be less measurable, it can be more qualitative, and therefore the metrics tend to be softer. And frankly, the channel metrics for social are not great. I think we're going to see a big revolution in this over the next couple of years, in being able to make brand measurements much easier. You saw Facebook release, its estimated ad recall like a few years ago. Not that many people use it, but I do think being able to measure that we're improving our brand, the easiest one to do is just reach, because like obviously if you're reaching more people at a higher frequency, then you're more likely to be building that first impression. But people don't like reach for some reason. So I think that method you described is a good way to do it. Find ways to survey your audience. That's why there's platforms that we've been discovering that let you do these, panel tests, consumer tests, that I think are really important as you start investing in brand, that you at least start testing, how well that message is being received by your audience. That's the way to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, I think one of the things that people are realizing is that I hope they're realizing, is that there are other ways to measure performance, I think, in a lot of cases. So again, going back to that brand example, it's like, yes, there's sort of the pure metrics of a brand, like the reach or even the recall or something like that we traditionally correlate. But there's also sort of it dovetails into the performance campaign. I think like a lot of what, in content marketing world too, like we think a lot about this a lot, which is that, if we're generating sort of awareness at the top of the funnel with content, then like that can have an impact on later direct response campaigns, like lowering the cost to acquire.
And it will.
Right. And so I think, if you're kind of fighting for brand budget, let's say, like that's one way to maybe frame the results, or try to measure or quantify the impact that it's going to have, is thinking about, not just the sort of immediate metrics, but sort of the downstream metrics and how you can quantify or measure those.
100%. Yeah, I think even just going down that trajectory for people of learning about what builds brands and what messages, brand messaging resonates, because it's far more emotional versus the rational kind of, functional feature-based stuff that works for direct response. Like I think being more in that world will shape, and learning more about that can really help our audience that's in social try to figure out what content is actually going to work well, and not just be funny for the sake of being funny, because that doesn't necessarily build a brand association, but having an emotional message that ties to what you do and how you help.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that's super interesting. Cool. Well, let's jump into some other questions. I think that was super helpful. So I guess when you think about optimization, just I guess broadly, I realize that's a huge topic, but is there a general process? Say you have a new client that comes online or whatever it is, and part of your goal is to optimize what they're already doing. Like, is there kind of a process or a checklist, or how do you think about the process of optimization?
I'd think of it very similar to thinking about like prioritization. Where are we spending the most time and getting the least impact, versus where are we getting the most impact and spending not as much time as we should? And then what can we learn from other people in the market, in the industry, all of that's so well documented, to sort of do more of that type of stuff. So, I mean, optimization always starts with working backwards from an actual tangible goal. Social media falls into the trap often of having either activity-based goals, like we need to be more consistent or post more frequently, which are fine, like maybe it's part of your OKR or something, like as a team member, like that could be one of your things that you're doing to hit your goal. But I think laddering back to a big business outcome goal, whether that's a strategic outcome, like next year, we want to be the leader in this market for this audience by this time period. That's really specific. Or we want to build a standout event with 20,000 guests, or we want to be able to grow 20% next quarter. Like, all of those things are ways of at least laddering back to a better goal to start with, and then we can frame the activities we're doing in social media against those. There are absolutely things you do in social media that are just support things, that are just maintenance things, that just take up time, and that's why you fall into those traps often, because social media versus other channels like PPC or something, like it just, the amount of time it takes versus the potential outcomes or value it has can be tricky to navigate. Like that ratio is not perfect by any means. It takes a lot of human labor still. But if you're trying to optimize something, what's important to remember is you have to give up something to start doing other things. So I just ask people, we always try to figure out, what can we stop doing? So the most common thing is we've seen clients who started at, they're posting 5 to 10 times on LinkedIn per day. We've seen that before. And partially because there's some best practice somewhere that says that the more, the higher the frequency, the better the reach you'll get, or the better chance you'll get. It's kind of like gambling. The more at bats you have to sort of go viral. And I mean, we just find that that's just often a huge waste of activity. And you're kind of, what's the point of posting twice as much? We typically are asking people to then spend less time creating content and more time, amplifying it, right? Or which could mean your team members sort of sharing that message. It could mean influencers and advocates sharing that message. It could mean you promoting it with paid. So that's one of the things that we try to do when it comes to optimization and that we think about. The other is just when it comes to, again, like saving time and getting more value, because that's what optimization is about. The other one is, can you get more mileage? Can you get more value from the investment you've already made in content? So those sort of build one, repurpose multiple times, content atomization discussion. it's sort of something we all know and talk about, and it fits into every part of marketing. Like content marketing, you probably talk about that. Here's one case study, and it becomes one email, and it becomes one, it's 5 social posts. Well, in social, it could break down a ton of different ways. So we ask people to think of their content strategy in that same pillar mindset. What is one pillar foundational piece of content? This is an example. Hey, we have our weekly show. We interview a guest. We have a 1 hour long YouTube clip video show, and we have therefore, up to 10 pieces of sort of interesting clips that we can then turn into content that's sort of pre-programmed differently for different formats on different channels, and it gives you more value. So we look for ways that we could help our clients, when it comes to optimization, get more value from investments they make in content by, not making just one-off stuff just because.
Right. Yeah. So I love, so I think what you just really laid out there is kind of a roadmap of optimization generally, but specifically through the lens of social, which is like, you have to start with kind of a very specific, the more specific, the better goal, right? You have to start with, we are trying to achieve X outcome by Y date or over the next Y months or whatever that is.
And not a social goal, and not just 10,000 followers. 10,000 followers could make sense if it's linked to something.
Yep. And that's actually one thing. That's actually one thing that I found that I think is sort of paradoxical as a marketer, is that like it can be scary sometimes to own like a business KPI versus like a marketing KPI. But I think it's actually better. It's like you can do much better work when you understand why that matters to the business, and you can think about it through that lens, right? So if my goal is to generate $1 million in sales through social versus get 10,000 followers or like whatever, like I would much rather have that revenue goal, even though it's scary and can feel like a lot of pressure. Like I can then again optimize my work towards that specific goal. And so working backwards, once you have a goal in mind, then it's really about assessing all the stuff that you're already doing and then identifying which of those activities are having the most impact with respect to that goal, right? So you have to think about it through that lens of that goal, right? You might be doing a lot of activity that maybe it's generating a ton of engagement on LinkedIn or whatever, but it's not actually helping you achieve your actual goal, which maybe it's revenue or whatever that specific KPI is. And then stepping back one step further is getting really tactical about, okay, how do I now optimize my activity so that I'm spending more of my time doing the stuff that's going to get me to that goal versus all the other stuff that we're already doing that's not driving toward that goal.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, and it's rare that like social, unless you're in e-commerce, I think you could say, hey, Facebook is going to generate $1 million in sales. Like that's more common. I think generally it's, we want to drive $1 million in net new revenue. Therefore, marketing's responsible for this type of pipeline. Therefore, social media, not as a person, social media, but as a channel, is going to contribute, 10% via the lead volume. And we're going to put the commiserate budget to do that, and then these supporting activities or these supporting sub goals, but not so it's not necessarily tied to that person then generating it, but the channel. But yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it. It doesn't mean that you can't still measure. Like social media KPIs are a great way to see if you're on track or not. It's a good way to just benchmark yourself. But I'm cautious to have people, weight the success of their work in social media based on things that are not a good leading indicator of business success and engagement. Like it really isn't. It's a really important success metric of like, of if your content is formatted interestingly, and if you kind of know your audience, so it's good for that. But anyway, that's the hill that I die on these days. Is like engagement is a nice metric to watch, but not the leading indicator of success.
100. I mean, I go back to that whole concept of like anytime you're talking about optimizing something, whatever you optimize for is going to dictate what activity you do. And so if you choose the wrong metrics, again, if you're optimizing for engagement, and that's not the thing that really matters at the end of the day, then like you're gonna make the wrong choices over and over again, because you're gonna do the stuff that gets more likes, but maybe has no impact on sales or traffic or whatever the thing that actually matters at the end of the day. And so you really have to think about, as you said, it might be valuable to measure that as some kind of an indicator or some kind of a general metric. But when you think about optimization, you really have to start with the right metric, right number. Yeah. Cool. I know we're almost out of time here. Do you have just like a couple extra minutes to go through some of these questions that we've gotten from folks in the chat here?
Let's do it.
Cool. Well, let's just start at the bottom here. So someone was asking about like specific marketing platforms. Do you think about, I'm assuming that's like, Facebook versus Twitter versus LinkedIn, whatever, like how do you kind of categorize or think about those in terms of quality or accuracy or whatever?
The best way to think about channel strategy is what are our channels we're using for advertising, and what are channels we're using for community building, and what are channels we're using for just communications. I think it's okay to have channels that you're only advertising on and that you only think of as an advertising channel, so therefore you don't have as much pressure to make it as consistent as the other place. Like you don't need to post every single day on Facebook if your customers are not following you. And it's mostly your employees and coworkers' parents, but you may want to use it as an advertising channel and therefore sort of take it seriously for that reason. So that's the first way I think about it. In terms of the actual channels, it's almost always the big four, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. There's a role for B2B in all of those. Those are the common channels. Facebook is the everything channel. It's the group channel. So it's really smart to, LinkedIn hasn't quite spun off the groups in a way that are really effective, but Facebook has. So groups tend to perform really well. If you have a user group or a community group, or you want to learn about your customers, that's a good way to do it. Facebook is also the best advertising channel in terms of its broad reach and capabilities. So it's great to test stuff there. Then, and retargeting is pretty reliable there. And then Instagram is not great for everyone still, but it has the same audience as everywhere else. I mean, it's got 1 billion plus users, so your customers are there. It's just, do they care about you there? Use it as an advertising channel and potentially use it as like a culture or talent channel. Like people do want to look at who you are there. Think of every channel, like to some extent, the research that I want to see out in the world is how much do people actually wait? How much do customers actually wait looking at your profiles when they're making a decision about working with you? That's something that we always talk about as marketers. Like, well, someone's going to look at our presence, and we want it at least to look professional. I'm actually really curious how much that matters. I don't know. For now, I say that like if you're going to have a presence, at least have a strategy for it. But that's the thing I really need to be sure of, because Instagram is one of those channels that people kind of have as more of like a expression of our brand, more visual, but it doesn't get a high level of reach. And I wonder if it's as valuable as we think, but that's what you do there. It's not a traffic channel, so I avoid people using Instagram as a traffic channel, like link in bio, that kind of BS. Like honestly, it'll barely drive any traffic for most brands. So keep that in mind. LinkedIn is kind of your bread and butter. So I'd say most companies, especially if you're trying to reach like a targeted executive decision maker, it's almost, LinkedIn is the reliable, because you can target them, because you can use Sales Navigator and connect one-on-one with them. So LinkedIn is the best way to filter out people based on their roles and titles and get in front of them. And it's therefore worth the premium. And then Twitter is its own beast in terms of you have to have someone on your team that gets it and that can be can sort of tap into the community there, like actually engage with the people there, because it's very network based. Even though it's one big feed of things, it's very sort of siloed off with your own pod of people.
Right. Yeah, I think one other interesting thing to think about there is like the way that you can use, say, like the targeting, the precision of the LinkedIn targeting to drive traffic against like a very targeted audience, and then use retargeting across everywhere else, right? So maybe it's harder to reach or to target like a specific person on the first touch through Facebook or Twitter or whatever. But if you get them on your site and you can pixel them and then retarget them later, you can reach them across all these other channels where it might be cheaper, for instance.
Yeah, I know a lot of people do that. You use the other channels for reach of a specific audience, then retarget them however you have the means to, whatever works best for you.
Yeah, cool. And this last question that we had was about like kind of planning a campaign, I guess, like kind of from end to end, and they're talking specifically about launching a new product. And so I think the main question here is basically like, how would you sort of divide up your energy or budget or whatever, like between pre-launch, the actual launch, and then like some kind of ongoing promotion?
I mean, I'd probably wait I think that's the right way to think about it. I don't know if there's a right budget allocation for each stage, but I'm imagining that, you know, a lot of it's time-based, and I think you probably put a little bit more weight into pre-launch, but not probably so far out. But you know, pre-launch is a great way to put budget into dialing in messaging, value props, whatever, to get people to sign up for, you know, wait list, to get someone to sort of build up an audience, as we know, you know, to put out some initial content to get people excited to use your people. But then, you know, so much of your success seems to, I think overall probably, it depends if you're making the sort of big bang, like we need 1 million users type company. We want to get 1 million people using our free product that becomes a freemium offering down the road. Like then you kind of need to put a lot of money into the launch and pre-launch more than the post-launch, because you know, if you have product-led growth and you're assuming that once you get initial users on board, they're telling other people, and that traction is built into the product, then you probably want to put 80% of your budget into like the pre-launch and launch phase.
Right.
But for most companies, honestly, I think almost all the magic happens post-launch. Like when you actually have your first customers and you're trying to get new ones. I'd say normally I'm like 70% of the magic will happen after the launch. So yeah. I'd say that's the way to look at it.
That's great. Yeah, that's really good way to think about it. Yeah, and I like that. I like that idea too of like really, especially if you're anticipating that you've got to drive, you know, kind of marketing led growth, I guess, for as an antithesis to product led growth, but still using some of that pre-launch to really dial in the messaging and stuff. I think that's huge, right? Because that's where you're going to get like the most bang for your buck. Like you don't want to be trying to find your audience or dial in your messaging after the product's out there, and wasting your money at that point. Like you know, spend that money early, figure out what's going to work or what seems to resonate with people, and then during the launch and after the launch, you'll have that stuff kind of figured out, hopefully, and you can put that money to better use.
I think we solved it.
All right, we have done all the marketing, so that's great. Cool. Well, Josh, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate you spending a couple extra minutes here, and thanks everyone for joining the stream today. One last call out, which is hit the subscribe button. Join us in top of the funnel at yesoptimist.com/tofu, TOFU. And Josh, where should people hit you up?
Hey, come find me on Twitter, JHCrack, and our website, wearesculpt.com. If you do wearesculpt.com/social media maturity quiz with dashes, we're actually just going to start putting up some of those resources. You can take the assessment yourself, and go from there. And of course, we're hiring and looking for people all the time.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks again, Josh. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks all for joining.
Thanks, Tyler. See you guys.
Cheers.